بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا من تحل به عقد المكاره ويا من يفثع به حد الشدائد ويا من يلتمس منه المخرج إلى روح الفرج.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to this podcast series of a commentary on Sahifah Sajjadiyyah by Mizan Institute. Inshallah, with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His blessing, we will begin this commentary on this very, very famous book that we will find in every household of the Shia, on every bookshelf in the homes of the Shia. A book that we all have, but at the same time, usually we are not very familiar with and we don't spend too much time with. And so, inshallah, this series will be a good excuse for us to get to know this book better and the du'as in it and benefit from all of that. Before we begin the actual series, as an introduction, in this session, what we want to do is we want to discuss some of the discussions that we have regarding the authenticity of this book. There are some observations/reservations in regards to its authenticity. I don't want to get too technical, but at the same time, I do want to point out a few things. And after that, we want to discuss what our great ulama and scholars have said in regards to this great book. Because at the end of the day, after all is said and done, after all the technical discussions have taken place, we are ones who follow the lead of our great ulama. Not 1, 2, 3, or 4 of them, but when we see the majority, if not all of them, are pushing us in a certain direction, and there is somewhat of a consensus on a matter, we will follow their lead for sure. And so I would really like to, towards the end of, after we go through these technical discussions, I want to also share with you some of the words of our greats in regards to this wonderful book. So let us begin with a little conversation on the sanad of this book. Just like any other book that we have in front of us that is bound and has a cover, has pages in it, this book that's in front of us didn't start out like this. Where did it come from? So the publishers have published this book that we have, but of course, usually these books will go back to these classical books, at least, will go back to a manuscript or manuscripts that are out there that in turn originated from the sayings of someone, the dictations of someone. Someone penned something, authored something, or said something that was recorded and was transcribed and distributed amongst the people. Sahifah Sajjadiyyah is no exception to this. There is a little difference, though, between Sahifah Sajjadiyyah in our classical works and other classical works that we have, Islamic literature that we have. And that is that, let's take Nahj al-Balagha, for example. Nahj al-Balagha is also a book. The thing is that this book, we all know, is a compilation of many other reports, accounts, hadiths, and narrations by Imam Ali alayhi salam. Khutbahs, sayings, letters, etc. Where did all of this come from? Where did each of these reports come from? Well, each of these reports, everyone knows, it's not like Imam Ali sat there and wrote all of them and compiled Nahj al-Balagha. Contrary to what some people, which are probably a minority, might believe that Imam Ali wrote Nahj al-Balagha himself. No, that's not the case, obviously. There are different reports, different accounts, different hadiths, different letters that are in there. Each of these is assessed separately and gauged when it comes to its authenticity, based on the standards that we have, the guidelines that we have, the rules that we have in regards to assessing and grading reports that we have from the time of Imam Ali, for example, for the time of the Imams and the Holy Prophet ﷺ. So, for example, in Nahj al-Balagha, one sermon might have a stronger chain of narrators, another one might have a weaker one. The book in its entirety is not like a Sahih book that Ahlus Sunnah have, where they might have this approach regarding their hadith books like Sahih al-Bukhari, where they say that everything in it is Sahih. We don't have such a thing. This is a famous thing that the Shia, we don't have a book that in which we say all the hadiths in it are authentic, reliable, and at the highest standards. Not necessarily. Each report is going to be verified, is going to be assessed separately. Now, this, what I'm saying, is according to the mainstream usuli school that we have. There might be some exceptions to this rule. They are not necessarily the majority. Some might argue the akhbaris. Some akhbaris don't look at our hadith books like this, our main hadith books. They will look at it also like sahih books, where they'll say everything in it is sahih. But all in all, the point I'm trying to make is that it's this, right now, the mainstream view, or the majority believe that no, even in a book like Usul al-Kafi, which is our main hadith book, that the hadiths in it have to be assessed separately. Okay, so having said all of that, let's move to a Sahifah Sajjadiyyah. I gave the example of Nahj al-Balagha, I mentioned Usul al-Kafi. These are all books with many different reports in them that are looked at separately, as I said. But with Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, there's a little bit of a difference. Because the book in its entirety is dealt with as one long report, one long hadith, let's say. Okay, I'm using these terms loosely, of course. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that this book was transmitted in its entirety. The book itself has a chain of narrators. Unlike Usul al-Kafi, unlike Nahj al-Balagha, each sermon has its own chain of narrators. And it's looked at differently, separately, and assessed independently. Each of them are looked at differently and assessed separately. But when it comes to Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, that's not the case. When we look at Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, it's not like one dua has a certain chain of narrators, another dua has another chain of narrators, and so on and so forth. And each of these are looked at separately and independently. No, the book in its entirety is seen as one unit, because that's how it has been transmitted. That's how it has been claimed that it has been sent down and reached us eventually. So, in a sense, it makes our job easier. Each of these du'as is not looked at separately and assessed separately. No, the whole book is looked at as one unit, as I said. The downside to this, though, is that if a person has an issue with the chain of narrators of this book in its entirety, then the whole book is going to be questionable for them. Now, I just say this theoretically speaking, of course. As I said, we will eventually see what our ulama say about this book and how great a book this is in their eyes. I have not come across one grand scholar who will question it seriously, this book. But we'll get to that. Some of the narrators have been questioned. Well, we'll get to some of those details in a little bit. So let's go and look at the discussion of the sanad of this book. I don't want to get too technical, as I said, but some of the points that I want to mention in regards to this sanad. So there are some who believe that the sanad of this book reaches Tawatur. The Sahifah Sajjadiyyah is a mutawatir book. What does that mean? Mutawatir means when a report reaches you by so many people that you become sure that this was actually said by the Holy Prophet ﷺ, let's say. It's impossible for this many people to have come together and conspired to make something up like this. It is impossible for so many people to be mistaken about the same matter. No, it's impossible. Especially if these people lived in different parts of the world, different lands, and so on. So I want to give an example for mutawatir, one that most of us, if not all of us, are familiar with, and that is the famous hadith of Al-Thaqalain, that the Holy Prophet ﷺ said, إِنِّي تَارِكٌ فِيكُمُ الثَّقْلَيْنِ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ وَعِتْرَةِ أَهْلِ بَيْتِي. That the Holy Prophet said, I'm leaving behind two weighty things, the Quran and my Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Alright, so we all know, and the whole Muslim Ummah knows, that these are words that were actually uttered by the Holy Prophet. How do we know? Because there's so many different people who narrated this, to the point that we are sure that they didn't all come together to make this up. They didn't all come together or be mistaken when it comes to this hadith. No, it's impossible. Now, this is going to be a subjective matter. It's not like we say, okay, if it reaches 10 people, the sanad, if it reaches 10 people, then that means it's mutawatir. If it's 9, it doesn't count. 10 onwards counts. No. It really is a subjective matter. There's no hadith or verse of the Quran that tells us a hadith is mutawatir when it reaches this number of narrators. No. It's subjective, and usually it has to be a significant amount. And there will be other little things that factor into something being mutawatir as well. I don't want to get into all of that right now. So that is the understanding of what a mutawatir hadith is. It's something that everyone agrees on. Now, some have said that the Sahifah Sajjadiyyah is also mutawatir. Why? Because so many people have actually narrated this, have transmitted this, and taught this book to others. And so we are sure, like this, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands. So of course it's going to be mutawatir. Now, they say that this is something that one of the 2 majlisis, if I'm not mistaken, the first majlisi, the father. Now, if this is to be the case, and Sahifah Sajjadiyyah is a mutawatir book, what that means is that we don't even need to look at the chain of narrators, the sanad of this book. Who narrated from who, who narrated from who. No. There's no point in that, because we're 100% sure there's so many people narrating it. We don't even need to talk about sanads anymore. We don't need to talk about authenticity anymore, because we are 100% sure that it has been said. Think about it. 1,000 people come to you from different cities, and they're all saying the same thing. Like they're telling you that we saw like this in the sky. So we saw something in the sky. So and so got elected. Such and such natural phenomenon took place. Like if 1,000 people come and tell you, you become sure. Because you know, like these people all couldn't get together and make up just one big lie, especially if it doesn't serve their own interests. Okay? These are just examples I'm giving here. There's no need to go and look at, okay, is this person reliable? Is this person reliable? And ascertain that all 1,000 people are reliable. No. Even if all 1,000 of them are normal people that you don't even know who they are, let's say. But when you have 1,000 different people coming and telling you the same thing, then you become sure that, okay, this can't be made up. Let's say, for example, you're walking into a store, and then 100 people that are coming out of the store, they're telling you, hey, be careful, there's something going on inside, someone has a gun or something. Well, after a while, you become sure. If only one person tells you, you might take precaution, but can you swear that they're, necessarily telling the truth? No. But if 100 different people that you can tell are not related to each other, don't even know each other, they're coming out of the store and they're like, hey, there's something going down inside, you're going to stay outside probably, because you become sure that they're telling the truth. All right, so those are just examples so we get an idea of what a mutawatir hadith looks like, and how we don't need to ascertain the reliability of each of those who are narrating it. Now, the claim is that Sahifah Sajjadiyyah is the same thing. It is mutawatir. Why? So many have narrated it, and that is true. There are so many people, and we'll get to this later maybe, that have actually transmitted this book to us. But the question is this: what is your exact definition of mutawatir? Does it mean that in this chain of narrators that might have, let's say, 10 links, even if one of those links or several of those links has many people in it, that is enough? Or no? Do all of the links have to have many people in them? Now I'm using the term link here. The Arabic or the technical term for this is tabaqa. When we have a chain of narrators, there will be different tabaqat in this chain. Each tabaqa, each stage or level of this narration, of this chain of narrators, it plays a role in the hadith being a mutawatir one or not. So let me explain. Let's say we have 10 links in a chain of narrators. Actually, you know what? Let's just say 3, okay? Just to make it easier. We have 3 levels, 3 stages, 3 links, 3 tabaqat in a chain of narrators. So, we have an imam. Person A is narrating from this imam. Person B narrating from person A. Person C narrating from person B. Okay? These are different tabaqat, they'll say, that are narrating from each other. This sanad, this chain of narrators, has 3 levels or stages. That's the word that I've noticed they use as equivalents for tabaqa. Some might say generations. All right? there are 3 different generations that are narrating from each other. Okay? Person A, of course, is going to be older than person B because he's teaching person B. He's narrating to person B. Person C usually is going to be younger than person B. So these are usually different generations of narrators. But I'm not going to use the word generation. I'm just going to use level or stage because that's what they've used as an equivalent for tabaqa. And when I say generation, I'm using it loosely. So I don't want to use that too much. Okay. So Imam, person A narrates from Imam, person B narrates from person A, and person C from B. Okay, so this chain has 3 tabaqas in it. Question. When we say a hadith is mutawatir, meaning it is such that I become 100% sure that this was said by the Imam, does that mean 1 or 2 out of these 3 stages, these 3 tabaqat, have to have so many people such that I become certain? Or no, all of the tabaqat, all of those links have to be a high number to the point where I become certain. So I'll give you an example, and I think we can all agree where it's going to be reasonable for us and justified for us to achieve certainty, and where it won't be justified for us to achieve certainty. So let's say Imam says something. Okay, the Imam narrates a hadith, says something. Person A hears from Imam. So person A now is carrying a knowledge he has attained from the Imam. He narrates this to person B. Okay? Person B narrates to person C. C isn't just one person though. C has D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, all the way to Z. There's a bunch of people in this C level. Okay? So A is one person. B is one person. And then level C is full of people. 40 people. Brothers and sisters, can these 40 come and tell me that B said this and A said this, and who is narrating that the Imam said this? Can I come to the conclusion that the Imam necessarily said that? Just because 40 people now, 100 people now are coming and telling me this. I think that the answer is very clear. No, I'm not going to become 100% sure that the Imam said it. What am I going to become sure about? I'm going to become sure that B told all these people something. But B is only one person who is narrating from A, that is also one person, who is narrating from the Imam. So a chain is as strong as its weakest link, or in this case, as strong as its weakest tabaqa. Even if level C has 40 people, level B has 40 people, but A is only one person, still we have the same issue. I can't become 100% sure. So, mutawatir is if all of the tabaqat are such that I become certain because of the high number. So level A has to be like 40 people itself who are telling 40 people who are telling 40 people. 40 people who are telling 60 people who are telling 80 people. It has to be something like that. It can't just be 40 people heard from the Imam. They all told level B, which is only one person, and then level B told 100 people. Still, 41 and then 100 isn't going to cut it either, because that one person in the middle is the weakest link. And this is how this hadith will not be mutawatir, because it's only one person narrating from 40 people. Although this one person is narrating from 40 people to 100 people. And those 100 people are telling us. But still, you have one of these tabaqat, one of these levels or stages of the chain of narrators is only one person. That is going to also cause a problem. And this is reasonable. It's not like we have Quran or Hadith for this matter. This is a normal, uqala'i, reasonable matter that everyone understands. Alright, so therefore, 40 people, if they heard from the Imam, they need to tell another like 40, 50 people. Those 40, 50 people have to tell another 40, 50 people. And of course, these numbers I'm using are just examples. That is going to be mutawatir. That is something that we're going to be gaining 100% certainty from. Other than that, we got a problem. So now, question. Going back to Sahifah Sajjadiyyah. Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, does it have such a thing or not? Does it have so many people in all of its tabaqat or no? there will be a lot of people narrating it. But those, let's say, 1,000 people that are narrating it, they're narrating it from, let's say, 100 people, who are narrating it from 5 people, who are narrating it from 1 person who's narrating it from the Imam. In the case of As-Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, what we find is the latter, unfortunately. And so this idea of, we don't need to look at the chain of narrators of this book because it is mutawatir, this argument is going to be very flawed. Because we'll get to the story, inshallah, in our next session, when we're reading the story of Sahifah Sajjadiyyah and how it was transmitted. You'll find that at the beginning of the chain of its narrators, you don't have 40 people, 50 people, 28 people, 100 people. You only have 1 or 2 people maybe. That's about it. Okay? As a matter of fact, it's only 1 person telling the story. Okay, so even if that 1 person tells all the people of the world, and all of the people of the world tell us, we have to understand that part of this sanad, part of this chain of narrators did not reach that threshold of tawatur, which renders the entire chain of narrators a non-mutawatir chain of narrators. I apologize if we got a little too technical, or it got a little confusing. Hopefully, it was as simplified as I could make it, and at the same time something that people can understand. All right, having said all of that, so this argument of, this book, we don't even have to worry about its authenticity because of its being mutawatir, this argument is not going to cut it. Some will say, no, we don't believe in it being mutawatir necessarily, because there's only 1 person at the beginning of the chain. Although nowadays, or even not even say nowadays, maybe 400 years later, after Sahifah Sajjadiyyah was initially transmitted, thousands of people were transmitting it to each other. Although that is the case, but because the beginning of the chain is only 1 person, it's not mutawatir for us. But we know that this is something that came from an Imam, and namely Imam as-Sajjad alayhi salam. Why? What is your argument? They will say that, look, the loftiness and the eloquence of the du'as are enough to prove that they are from Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. Now this is something that you will find in Hawza circles and discussions, that sometimes the madmoon, the content of a report, of a dua, of a letter, of a sermon, is so high and lofty that you're like, you know what? It's only an infallible that could have said such a thing. It's impossible for normal people to say such a thing. Now, sometimes it's like a one-liner. That might be a little harder. But then you have a whole book of du'as like this one. And you look at the whole book, you're like, come on. It's not possible for normal people to come up with something like this. And so they say, look, this is our reason for this book being a book we are sure originated from the mouth of an infallible being, namely Imam as-Sajjad alayhi salam. Now, who of the ulama believes in such a thing, we'll get to later, inshallah, when I'm sharing with you what they have said in regards to As-Sahifah Sajjadiyyah. But for now, we're talking about theory. So there are some who have this belief. Well, then some will come out and say, no, that we don't agree with that either. We have a problem there as well. And so just because something is very lofty, very eloquent, doesn't mean necessarily that it was something that can only have been said by an infallible. Albeit, the only exception that will be made is the Quran itself. The Quran itself is going to be a different story. They'll say that over there we'll find that the eloquence / the loftiness is one of the main reasons for it being a miracle. A miracle. And we know because of that it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially the fact that the Quran itself challenges the people to come up with something like it. Okay, so that is something that we are 100% sure about. Other than that, we're not 100% sure. All right, so that is something else that we have. Another argument. Now, this argument is more of a subjective one, and it's going to be one that isn't going to be refuted the way the mutawatir one was refuted, because the mutawatir one, we have a clear-cut definition for it. And that is that each of the tabaqat has to have enough people for us to reach certainty. Although the number is subjective, but we know that there has to be, for sure, a high number in each of those tabaqat. Okay? So that one is clear cut. So once you don't fit that description of mutawatir, that argument goes out the window. But this one, the one about loftiness and eloquence, all in all, it's going to be a subjective one, and some will agree, some will disagree. But all of these will be a good clue and hint, at least, that I don't want to say hint, a strong clue that okay, it's very unlikely, at least, that someone other than an imam said all of these du'as. All right, let's move on though. If none of these work, then we do have to look at the chain of narrators. If none of those arguments hold for an individual, we have to look at the chain of the narrators of this book. And I'm going to be quite honest with all of you brothers and sisters. The chain of narrators of the book, according to some like Ayatollah al-Khou'i and others, there are people in the chain that we're not 100% sure about. And so the chain of narrators, going by the standards of Rijal, Ilm al-Rijal, and the science of narrators of Hadith and their biographies and their reliability, according to those standards, this chain of narrators doesn't meet those standards. Alright, so what are we left with, brothers and sisters? We are left with a book that is, when we look at it, is so great. At the end of the day, it has been narrated by so many scholars and narrators, although it's not mutawatir, but it is a book that they have all accepted. It is very hard to turn a blind eye to all of this. This is something that I want to actually elaborate on a little bit. There's a point in all of this. The idea that it's not mutawatir, the idea that the eloquence / loftiness not necessarily is going to prove that it's super authentic, and the fact that the chain of narrators does have issues. I want to draw a conclusion from this, that the fact that we have all of this, but at the same time, when we look throughout the 1,000 plus years of scholarship of the Shi'i ulama, what we find is that they have, all I can say maybe accepted this book. Now, they will say that because it doesn't meet the standards of Rijal, we can't use it when it comes to the fiqh and the do's and don'ts of Islam, and to deem something haram or halal based on it only. Yes, but at the same time, they say, look, this book for sure is one of the greatest sources of knowledge and spirituality of Islam, to the point that even Sunni scholars have praised it, and we'll get to a story regarding that as well. So now I want to get to what some of these ulama have said. These are ulama of different times, different eras, different approaches, different ways of looking at things, but they all come together when it comes to Sahifah Sajjadiyyah. As I said, a book like Nahj al-Balagha won't have this. Why? In the way that Sahifah does. Why? Because Nahj al-Balagha is a compilation of separate reports, separate letters and sermons and hadith and so on. And so, although it is given a lot of importance by our ulama, at the same time, they might have different opinions on some of the hadiths that are there, some of the letters, some of the khutbahs that are there. I personally have seen there's discussions on different sermons that if they are actually from Imam Ali or not. So there are different opinions on those. All in all, Nahj al-Balagha, of course, is accepted as one of the main books that we have as Shia. But all in all, it does have those observations / reservations regarding different reports that are in it. But Sahifah, on the other hand, what you find is that you won't find scholars pointing out that, yeah, like this one dua, we're not sure about this one, but the rest we're cool with. No. What you find is that they will take it in its entirety, and they will respect it in its entirety, something higher than even what you find towards Nahj al-Balagha, as I said. So it's different. For me, it was very fascinating looking into all of this, how our scholars accept this book as one of our main sources, although we have these issues with the sanad of it. Because at the end of the day, if you were to cut up this book into the different du'as that are there, and then each du'a cut it up into different separate sentences, if you go and look for something else in the Quran or in our hadith corpus other than what these du'as have, that will corroborate and echo what these different lines and sentences of this dua are saying, you'll find something similar in the Quran, in our hadiths. And this is something that some ulama have pointed out, that just because you're not able to prove something through the sanad only, doesn't mean you have to cast it aside. On the contrary, when we look at the du'as of Sahifah, they are in reality echoing what the Quran is saying, echoing what our hadith corpus is saying. And all you find in there is the teachings, those pure, rich teachings of Islam. In other words, you don't find anything crazy in this where you're just like, wait a minute, where'd this come from? Like, this is something that you don't find anywhere else. This is something new. This is an isolated matter. No, you don't find anything like that in it. Inshallah, we'll see as we go through the different du'as of this book. And there's a reason why our scholars have paid so much attention to this book. And that brings me to some of these scholars and what they have said. This is just a random list of sayings that we have and different opinions and ideas we have from our scholars. It's not a comprehensive one by no means. By no means at all. What I can say is that all the way back to Shaykh al-Tusi and before him, you'll find that all of the scholars have spoken about this book, okay? But I just wanted to bring some of the more later scholars so that it's something that we can also relate to, kind of. So I'll start with Wahid Bahbahani. When he's speaking about hadiths whose content is enough for us to be able to tell that this is something that the Imam said, when he's speaking about that idea that I mentioned before, his example, one of the examples at least, is that of Sahifah Sajjadiyyah. He says, look, when we look at this book, that's enough for us to know that this is something the Imam said. So he's from that camp, the ones that say the loftiness or the eloquence is enough. As-Sayyid al-Burujirdi also falls into that category. The great Ayatollah Burujirdi, who in his time was the one and only marja' that the entire Shia world, or the majority of the Shia world, would go to and refer to. He says the following. He says, وَلَا يَخْفَى أَنَّ كَوْنَ الصَّحِيفَ مِنَ الْإِمَامِ مِنَ الْبَدِيهِيَّاتِ. He says this is one of those matters that is of the badihiyat. It is evident, it's clear, it's axiomatic. There's no argument there, there's no discussion there. Don't even try to discuss with me that this is from Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam. وَهِيَ زَبُورُ آلِ Muhammad. This is the book, this is the Psalms of Al Muhammad, this book. يَشْهَدُ بِذَلِكَ. My reason for this? يَشْهَدُ بِذَلِكَ أُسْلُوبُهَا نَظْمُهَا مَضَامِينُهَا. The way this book is, the way it's organized and written, the content, those lofty ideas that you find in it, all of these are a good reason for why we know this is from Imam al-Sajjad, he says. Now, the lofty content within it, التي يلوح منها آثار الإعجاز, that you can say, you can sense miraculousness from. So it's not just any book. He feels that this is borderline miracle. Okay, so that's Ayatollah Burujirdi's understanding of this matter. Now, Ayatollah Burujirdi, of course, he is someone who is he is one of those who wrote a whole collection on hadiths by the name of Jamu' Hadith al-Shia. A huge collection. This is a person that is very familiar with hadiths and how it works. Wahid Bahbahani that I mentioned, he's a guy that went against the akhbaris of his time, and he's very strict when it comes to these matters. But he's also saying that, the content proves that this is from Imam al-Sajjad. Let's move on. Ayatollah Mar'ashi Najafi, also very famous. Now, this is where I want to share with you a story that he has with a Sunni scholar. It says in the year 1353 AH, so that's going to be about almost 100 years ago, like about 90-ish years ago, from the time that this recording is being recorded. We're in 1444 right now. It says that he sent a copy of As-Sahifah Sajjadiyyah to the grand scholar At-Tantawi. He sent this to Cairo. At-Tantawi is from Al-Azhar. And so Tantawi, who is a mufassir, who is one who is an author, and he's a grand scholar, he writes back to Ayatollah Mar'ashi Najafi. He says that your letter reached me, which came along with this book of Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, which are the words of the Zahid Imam, Ali Zayn al-Abidin ibn al-Imam al-Hussein al-Shaheed. I have received this letter that came with this book that you sent me. Rayhanatul Mustafa. So all of these are attributes of Imam Hussein, who Imam Zayn al-Abidin is the alayhi salam is the son of. He says, this book, I received it with honor, and I found it to be a unique book that contains teachings and ulum and ma'arif and knowledge and wisdom that you will not find elsewhere. And he says this is so bad that us, Ahl Sunnah, have not heard of such a work from before, and that we are deprived of such a rich legacy of nubuwwah and of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. This legacy, this heritage of the Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, this heritage of nubuwwah and prophethood and imamah. He says it's unfortunate that we don't have access to this, that we didn't know about this. And then it goes on to say that as I read this book, what I can see is that this work, this writing, these words are not words of the creation. These are higher than the normal words of creation, but at the same time, they are under the words of the Creator, meaning the Quran. So this book is not a normal book, but it's not that high where it is going to be up to par to the Quran. And of course, no one claims such a thing. So that is beautiful. This is from At-Tantawi, and it's a famous story. You can easily find this story online even. A few others who don't believe that we need to assess this book's chain of narrators. They are people like Sayyid Ali Khan Shirazi, who has maybe the most famous commentary on Sahifah Sajjadiyyah by the name of Riyad al-Salikin. That's a very famous commentary. If Nahj al-Balagha has the commentary of Ibn Abil Hadid, and that's like the most famous commentary, then the most famous commentary of Sahifah Sajjadiyyah is going to be Riyad al-Salikin by Sayyid Ali Khan Shirazi. So this individual also, he says, we don't need to even do a sanadi analysis. Sayyid Muhsin al-Amin, the one who wrote the grand work of A'yan al-Shia, he also says the same thing. Imam Khomeini, he says, when he's speaking of this book, now he's speaking it in the context of fiqh. He says that, yes, the chain of narrators isn't going to be a strong one, but وَعُلُوُّ مَضْمُونِهَا وَفَصَاحَتُهَا وَبَلَاغَتُهَا. He speaks about these things. He says the content, the eloquence of it, all of this, تُوجِبْ نَحْوَ وُثُوقٍ عَلَى صُدُورِهَا, that it gives us this certainty that this was actually said by the Imam. This was issued by Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam. He does say one thing though. He says, لَكِنْ لَا تُجِبُهُ فِي جَمِيعِ فَقَرَاتِهَا وَاحِدَةً بَعْدَ وَاحِدَةً. He says, for me, it's not going to be such that I'm 100% sure that every single word of it is accurate. Yes, but he does say that, look, I know all in all that this book goes back to him. The reason why he says word for word or line for line for me isn't established, he wants to draw a conclusion from this. He says, حَتَّى تَكُونَ حُجَّةً يُسْتَدَلُّ بِهَا فِي الْفِقْهِ. He says, I can't use this in fiqh the way I can use other hadiths that have an authentic chain of narrators. He says, I can't use it. So he's saying if he has a reservation on this book, it is only because he can't use it, he says, for fiqh. But all in all, he says, no, I believe that this book, I have certainty that this book is from him. To the point that he's also famously known to have said regarding Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, he calls it the Al-Qur'an al-Sa'id, the Quran, the ascending Quran. And there's a little explanation that I need to give here. Ascending Quran, meaning what? Meaning that, look, there's one Quran, so to speak, not so to speak actually, there is one Quran that was sent down, that descended from Allah unto us. But there's also a Quran-like book, which is Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, that is a Quran as-Sa'id. It is a Quran that is ascending from creation to Allah. And that is Sahifah Sajjadiyyah. The du'as in general are things that ascend from us to Allah, connect us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And of course, Sahifah Sajjadiyyah will be at the top of that list of du'as. And so it is going to be the ascending Quran, he calls it. It's a beautiful way of describing the Sahifah Sajjadiyyah. The Quran part shows that it is above mankind's word, but the fact that it's ascending and not descending shows that it is below the word of God, which is the Quran. Okay, so these are some of those individuals that have said that, look, the sanad, might be a problem, but we don't care about that part. It's obvious that this book goes back to the Imam. Who else do we have? Ayatollah Hassan Zada Amuli, that famous Arif. He says Sahifah needs to be a textbook in the houses. It needs to be taught in the seminaries as a book that you study, not that just one that you recite. We need to see how much we can extract from this book of our beliefs, of rich teachings of Islam. So that's also a beautiful way to look at it. He believed that it should be a textbook of the houses. Ayatollah Ja'far Subhani, another famous contemporary scholar who is alive today, he says that this book is absolutely a divine school for us, that we learn akhlaq from, social matters from, politics from. These kinds of things we learn from this book that Sayyid al-Sajjadiyyah has taught us through inspiration from his forefathers and from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ayatollah Makarim, he also says, that if there's no reason, this is interesting, he says if there's no reason to prove that the school of the Ahlul Bayt is the true school of Islam, Nahj al-Balagha and Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, these two are the best reasons to prove such. So, brothers and sisters, you tell me, these ulama, are they worried about the chain of this book necessarily causing an issue? No, absolutely not. Ayatollah Makarim, he goes on and he says, this precious book, after the Quran, Nahj al-Balagha, is the most important book and treasure of the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam that we have. He says the great ulama, scholars, they would give it a lot of importance, to the point that, and he says, I say this without exaggeration, thousands of great scholars have mentioned this book in their ijazat as well. Those things they have permission to narrate hadiths for. So Sahifah is one of those things they take pride in, that they have ijazah and permission from their teachers to narrate and transmit to future generations. Thousands, he says. He says this book is referred to as the Zabur of Al Muhammad, the Psalms of Al Muhammad, to the point that we can't find even one similar dua to the du'as of this book in other schools of thought. And finally, Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli, he says, you can't be a Hawza student, you can't be a seminarian, a sheikh, a person who's wearing the amama, the turban. You can't be this type of person, but not be holding this book. Now, holding this book meaning that you're familiar with it, that you're an expert in it, not that you have to always be holding it in your hand, of course. Because if you're that type of person and you're not acquainted with this book, you're not an expert in this book, you're not reading this book, then this is a big loss for you. So these are our scholars, some of our scholars, some of which split hairs when it comes to matters of naqliyat and the transmitted words of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. These are strict individuals when it comes to these matters, but when it comes to Sahifah Sajjadiyyah, everyone puts their hands up and they say, we have nothing to say about this book except that it is one of our most important sources. To the point that we have hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts for this book throughout history. The scholars of Islam have transmitted it, and all the ijazat and permissions that they have in regards to it. So that is just, I wanted to give all of you a little bit, just scratch the surface in regards to the different discussions we have in regards to this book. On one hand, of course, the sanad has those issues, but on the other hand, these are some of our scholars, just the tip of the iceberg really, of the scholars that have spoken about this book, and how all of them accept this book as one of those things that we have maybe taken for granted, and that we have to spend a lot of time on, and we have to value and cherish, inshallah. And so, inshallah, what we have in mind, just like our Nahj al-Balagha commentary, is to cover as much area as we can in regards to the du'as of this book. Not to necessarily go very deep, there are very deep, lofty concepts. We will touch on those as much as possible. But at the same time, the point is to try to cover as much area as we can, and to try to finish this book if Allah blesses us with a long enough life for that. Of course, I'm not infallible. I'll be sharing my own ideas as well. But usually what we're going to be doing is we're going to be referring to some of the main commentaries that we have out there, some of the most important ones that we have out there, if we get stuck in anything, or just all in all for any nice points that are out there. So as I said, I'm not going to be infallible, but inshallah we're going to try to keep things to the basics and try to uncover as much treasure as we can from this book through the commentary that we have, inshallah. Having said all of that, in our next session, we want to start this book, but before we get into the du'as, the actual du'as, there is the story of where this book actually came from and how it was transmitted initially. It's an interesting one, and there are some nice lessons and points in that story as well. I'm very fond of the story, and inshallah, we will share that with you in our next session. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.